SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Every year, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry conducts its Work Health and Safety Survey, and this year it's exposed a growing problem. About a third of small business owners say they've been diagnosed with a mental health condition, which is a dramatic increase on comparable years. The Chamber's CEO, Andrew McKellar, acknowledges the role inflation and rates are playing, but says it's also due to a big increase in regulation. The Chamber has some plans to try and improve the situation with policymakers. But first, why and how is the Work Health and Safety Survey conducted? Andrew explains to Jeff Waters.
Well, work health and safety, Jeff, is really one of the central issues for business. It's a big area of compliance. Business has a lot of responsibilities in those areas. So we're really, I think, getting out there, wanting to talk to business, exploring a number of different aspects which are emerging in the work health and safety space that should be priorities for business. So whether that's around awareness on the compliance arrangements, the legislative and regulatory framework, or whether it's around specific issues, issues like management of biohazards, impact on small business, these sorts of things. We need to know how that's impacting on business so that we can feed that back to regulators, to policymakers, and to ensure that those objectives that are there, that we have safe, healthy workplaces and that business, is complying with its obligations. That's really our motivation.
How do you investigate and gather all of this information?
Well, really what we're doing is selecting a survey sample. We're going out to a range of businesses. In the case of this particular survey, we used an independent surveyor to go and contact a range of businesses. We have our network as well. So we have the Chamber network around Australia, state and territory chambers, and we also have 70 national industry associations. So depending on the issue, we'll work through them. And sometimes they are working with us to send out and collect data from their own individual members. Around Australia, the state and territory chambers, there's over 400,000 business members within that network.
And it's open to contribution from everybody, but it must take a long time. Is that a whole year's work?
Well, normally with a survey, we will go for a small sub-sample. We're not trying to contact that many businesses for each survey, but we want to get a representative result. And obviously then we have different channels that we can use to speak to business to collect that information, to get the feedback. Absolutely.
Well, what have you found and what does the report say?
Well, the most recent Work Health and Safety Survey, I think probably one of the things that jumps out straight away when we look at the results of that is particularly from a small business point of view. So we got a result this time which showed that 34% of all small business owners came back and said, look, we have been diagnosed with some sort of mental health condition. So whether that's anxiety, depression, some other stress-related condition. That's, I think, quite an alarming result. That's much higher than we got last time we did this survey, which is, in fact, 2022 was the comparable time that we asked this question. And at that point, 22% of small business owners were coming back with that sort of result. So it's significantly higher than that. And if you look at ABS data, the general population, it's about 21.5%. So that tells us that there's something going on, for small business owners. And we can tie that back in with a survey that we did earlier this year, our Small Business Conditions Survey. What that showed is that over the past 1 to 2 years, the level of regulatory compliance that small business owners have to deal with, that's been going up quite markedly. Of course, there's always issues of, tax compliance and obligations, various other business regulatory arrangements that they've got to deal with, including work health and safety. But the one which has been changing most in that time frame is workplace relations. The federal government's been pursuing a big agenda of changes there. That's had a big impact. So in terms of compliance for small business going forward, if they think about employing somebody, They've now got to jump through a whole number of new hoops. The definition of employment has changed. Arrangements for casual employees have changed. If you want to deal with an independent contractor, that's changing. You've got to be able to provide access in terms of union delegates. That's an issue. There's a new right to disconnect, which appeared from nowhere out of left field at the last minute. There's all sorts of things like this. And what that means is it just makes it harder for a small business when they're making that decision about whether or not to employ somebody, making sure that they're complying with that, making sure that they're not making errors in terms of administration of payroll and so on. All of these issues have become just harder to grapple with, and that takes time for anyone who's running a small business.
But this is also a time of great economic difficulty. You can't discount that as well, can you?
Not at all. So look, that's very true. And I think what we've seen over the past year or so, at the very least, business has been walking a tightrope. So we have quite fragile economic conditions. Things like productivity's been growing very slowly. We've had the pressure of higher interest rates, rising cost pressures. So that's been a big factor. Businesses having to juggle those rising cost pressures. So supply chains have been difficult. I think some of that has improved a little bit in the past 12 months, but nonetheless, it's still quite a fraught business situation. So beyond that, I think really it makes conditions for business, very difficult to juggle. So until we see those cost pressures coming off, until we see issues like the labour market remains pretty tight, pretty competitive. We've seen wages pushing up a little bit. Maybe that's topped out now and some of the pressures are starting to come off, but access to skilled labour has been a huge issue for businesses across the board. So juggling all of those things in a challenging business environment where consumers are also feeling that pressure, I think, means that, it is a pretty difficult balancing act for many business owners.
So, Andrew, what can be done about this?
Well, we think, this is a critical time. We're coming into a federal election. We've got to have a focus on a number of things. How do we get costs coming down and coming down sustainably? That's a key issue. We say that productivity is a huge part of that. Government getting its own house in order is priority number one. The federal budget at the moment, we've had 2 years of budget surpluses, so, that's good. That's a good result. But we're heading back into a situation now of structural budget deficits over the coming years. Expenditure is continuing to grow. It's well up over 25% of GDP, 26% and going north. That means that key programs like the NDIS, like aged care, like healthcare, like defence, interest on public debt, these areas of expenditure are growing in some cases by double digit. And if that's happening, then the pressure is on for government revenues to also rise. So the tax burden, the risk is tax becomes more difficult going forward. We've got to get the budget in order. We've got to take that pressure off the budget, and only then can we start to look at tax reform. We've got to get the balance right in the future on tax between income tax and other forms of taxation. That's part of driving business investment, which has been weak. And another area with something like that, things like the instant asset write-off, we think that's good for business. The problem with the way that's been administered in recent years is it's been legislated at the last minute, at the end of the financial year. You need to provide certainty. It needs to be legislated in advance, preferably made a permanent part of the tax system and, at a higher level of threshold. So you should be able to claim a larger deduction, say 50,000 deduction. We wanted to apply to more businesses with turnover up to 50 million. We don't want this to be something that's left to the last minute as an afterthought. So that's one, I think, example of a key area of reform that we would like to see. The other thing that I would prioritise at the moment, and that is taking the regulatory pressure off small business. We've said we think that in the Fair Work Act, the threshold, the definition for a small business should be lifted from less than 15 employees up to 25 employees. And many of these things that have, these onerous requirements that have come in around casual employment arrangements, definition of employment, labour hire, all of those things, small business shouldn't have to deal with the complexity that's there in that space. So we think if you give small businesses with up to 25 employees a bit of a more even break, give them a fair deal, It reduces the compliance burden that they face, and we think that's doing something meaningful for small business to give them back time to devote to running their businesses as they should be.
That was Andrew McKellar, CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel.